The sun beat down on the frontier town like a merciless overseer, bleaching the streets and coating every window ledge in dust. The main road, though alive with the shuffle of boots and the creak of wagon wheels, carried an air of weariness, as though every soul who lived there had grown accustomed to struggle. At the far end of this street, a woman appeared, walking with a kind of determined fragility. Her clothes were worn thin from too many miles, patches of faded fabric straining at the seams. At her side, a small girl clung tightly to her mother's hand, stumbling a little with each step, her face pale from hunger. They had been traveling for days, surviving on scraps of jerky and stale biscuits the mother had rationed carefully, stretching what little she had until it could stretch no further. But now nothing remained. The girl's stomach growled so loudly that she winced, clutching it in silence, not wanting to burden her mother with words she couldn't solve. Still, the child's eyes kept drifting toward the bakery cart that passed, the smell of warm bread hanging in the air like a cruel taunt. The mother held her head high, even though her body screamed of exhaustion. She had always been proud, but pride could not feed her daughter. She had promised herself that no matter what, she would get her little one something to eat today. So, with the last of her coins clutched in her palm, a few nickels and pennies, hardly more than pocket change, she guided her child toward the heart of town, the general store. The building stood solid and square, its sign faded but still readable. This was where the townsfolk bought everything from flour and coffee to tools and tobacco. Inside, the shelves were stocked with enough goods to feed a family for weeks. To the mother, it seemed like a fortress of plenty, one that might finally offer the mercy she needed. She swallowed her hesitation, smoothed her daughter's tangled hair with trembling fingers, and pushed open the door. The bell above the frame jingled, sharp and metallic, drawing a few curious glances from those inside. The store smelled of spices, dry goods, and oiled wood. Men in wide-brimmed hats leaned against the counter, chatting idly, their spurs clinking faintly. A woman with a basket of flour looked up from her list, her eyes narrowing briefly at the sight of the ragged newcomer. The mother ignored the stares and approached the counter. Her daughter pressed close against her side. She set her coins down carefully, as though the gesture alone might persuade them to mean more than they did. "Bread, please," she said, her voice soft but steady. "And some milk, if you'll allow it." For a moment, there was silence. The clink of her coins echoed louder than it should have. Behind her, the girl shifted nervously, her small hand tightening around her mother's fingers. The mother stood straighter, waiting, praying the storekeeper would see her not as a beggar, but as a woman desperate to care for her child. Her heart pounded with the weight of hope. She imagined walking out of the store with a loaf of bread under her arm, her daughter smiling again, her hunger soothed for at least one night. She thought of the relief of seeing her child's face brighten with even the smallest comfort. That picture kept her upright, kept her voice calm, though her insides trembled. The dusty town outside continued its rhythm, the wheels of wagons rolling, horses neighing, townsfolk moving about their errands. But for the woman and her child, time seemed to pause within the four walls of that general store. The first step had been taken, the plea made. All that remained was the storekeeper's answer. The coins lay scattered across the counter, dull and meager against the polished wood. The storekeeper, a stout man with a bristled mustache and a belly that strained against his vest, glanced down at them with an expression that hovered between disdain and amusement. His hands, thick and calloused from years of hauling crates rather than kindness, drummed lazily on the counter before he spoke. "That all you got?" His voice was low but cutting, carrying easily across the store. The mother swallowed hard, steadying herself. "It's enough for bread, and maybe a little milk for my girl." She tried to keep her tone respectful, but there was an edge of pleading beneath it she could not hide. The storekeeper chuckled, shaking his head slowly as though she had asked for the moon. "Lady, this ain't charity. Prices have gone up. That handful of pennies won't cover a crust." A few townsfolk nearby had turned to watch. A man in a dust-stained hat pretended to browse sacks of beans while keeping his eyes fixed on the exchange. A woman clutched her basket tighter, her lips pressed into a thin line. No one spoke, Though the silence grew heavy, the weight of judgment pressing down on the desperate mother, she leaned closer, lowering her voice in hope that he might soften if she spoke gently. "Please, sir, she's hungry. Just a loaf, nothing more. I'll find work. I'll pay you proper once I can." Before she could finish, the storekeeper's hand came down on the coins with a sharp slap. He shoved them back toward her, the clinking sound as merciless as a hammer on iron. "I said no. You think I'm running a soup line here? You pay the price, or you walk out empty-handed." The child flinched at the sudden noise, pressing herself against her mother's side. Her small eyes, wide and shining with unshed tears, stared at the storekeeper with a mix of confusion and fear. She didn't understand why he wouldn't give them bread. Bread was simple. Bread was everywhere. Why would he keep it from them? The mother's cheeks burned with shame. Her pride, already battered, threatened to collapse entirely under the weight of humiliation. She bent quickly to gather the scattered coins, her fingers trembling as she snatched them up. Each coin felt like a reminder of her helplessness, of the thin line between survival and ruin. The storekeeper, emboldened by her silence, sneered. "Best you move along before I call the sheriff. Ain't no place in my shop for beggars." The words cut deeper than the refusal itself. She wasn't a beggar. She had worked hard all her life, stood beside a man who had promised to care for her, raised her child with what little she could scrape together. She had walked miles, crossed rivers, slept under the stars with her daughter curled against her chest, just to find a new chance at life. And here she stood, being called less than nothing. Behind her, a few murmurs rippled through the customers. Some shook their heads at the storekeeper's cruelty, but none stepped forward. It was easier to watch than to act. The mother felt their eyes on her like prying fingers, tearing at what remained of her dignity. Her daughter's soft sob broke the silence, a small, heartbreaking sound muffled against the fabric of her mother's dress. The girl clutched her stomach, whispering, "Mama, I'm so hungry." The mother bent down, brushing her child's hair back from her face, whispering words she didn't believe herself. "Hush now, sweetheart. Mama will take care of you." But as she straightened, gathering her strength, her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. The storekeeper turned away, muttering under his breath about drifters and useless mouths. To him, the matter was finished. He had protected his goods, his money, his pride. But for the mother and her child, the refusal was not just about bread. It was about being cast aside, unwanted, unseen. With her daughter's small hand in hers and her coins clutched tightly once more, she turned toward the door. The jingle of the bell as it opened sounded more like a final judgment than an exit. The dusty street awaited them again, but this time with the bitter taste of rejection in their mouths. Yet, as they stepped into the glaring sunlight, neither of them noticed the pair of eyes watching from the shadowed corner of the store, eyes that had followed every word, every tear, every insult, eyes belonging to a cowboy who had remained silent, but not unmoved. The wooden door of the general store creaked as it swung closed behind them, shutting out the smell of spices and tobacco, shutting out the hushed whispers of townsfolk who had done nothing to help. The sound of the bell above the frame lingered in the mother's ears, mocking her like a final insult. She stepped back onto the hot street, blinking against the glare of the sun. The little girl trudged at her side, her small boots dragging in the dust. For a while she said nothing, only held tightly to her mother's hand. But the child's silence was heavier than words, pressing against the mother's already burdened heart. She could feel her daughter's thin fingers trembling within her grasp. "Mama," the girl whispered at last, her voice so faint it was nearly carried off by the dry wind. "I thought he would give us bread." The mother swallowed hard, her throat dry as stone. She wanted to tell her daughter that the world was fair, that kindness outweighed cruelty, that no child should ever have to beg for food. But the truth clawed at her, raw and merciless. She knelt down in the dust, cupping her daughter's thin cheeks in her hands, forcing herself to smile, though her lips trembled. Sometimes, "Sweetheart," she murmured, brushing the child's tangled hair back from her forehead. "People forget how to share. But don't you worry. Mama's going to find us something. I promise." The child nodded, but her little shoulders quaked. Then came the tears, silent at first, glistening on her lashes, then spilling freely down her cheeks. Her stomach growled loudly, and she clutched it, curling forward with a sob that tore through the mother's chest like a knife. The girl buried her face in her mother's dress, her small fists gripping the worn fabric as if to anchor herself against the storm of hunger and shame. The sound of her weeping carried across the street, mingling with the creak of wagon wheels and the distant whinny of horses. Passers-by glanced their way, some with pity in their eyes, others with indifference, but no one stopped. The mother gathered her child into her arms, rocking her gently, though her own body trembled with weakness. "Hush now, my darling," she whispered again and again, though each word was stitched with desperation. She kissed her daughter's hair, tasting the dust and salt of tears. "Mama's here. You're not alone." But inside, her soul was breaking. She had endured many hardships on her own, nights without shelter, long stretches of road with nothing but her will to keep her going. But watching her child suffer was a torment she could not bear. Every tear the girl shed felt like a failure carved into her bones. A boy with a basket of apples walked by, balancing the fruit easily in his arms. The girl's eyes, red and swollen, lifted toward the sight, her longing plain. The mother quickly turned her daughter's head back against her shoulder, not wanting her to see what they couldn't have. It was cruelty enough to be denied bread. She couldn't allow the girl to dream of apples too. Still, as they sat there in the dust, the child's sobs grew softer, quieter, until only hiccuping breaths remained. The mother stroked her hair, rocking her gently, whispering stories of better days to come, stories she hardly believed herself, but clung to as a drowning woman clings to driftwood. The town bustled on around them, but to the mother, the world had narrowed to the fragile body in her arms. Hunger had reduced her daughter to tears, and the mother knew she could not let another day pass like this. She would beg, she would work, she would walk until her feet bled, but she would not watch her child starve. What she didn't see, what she couldn't know, was that her daughter's tears had not gone unheard. Inside the dim corner of the store, the cowboy who had been watching all along had risen from his chair. His jaw was set, his eyes shadowed with something deeper than pity. He had seen enough, and the child's tears had struck a chord no cruelty could silence. From the corner of the general store, where the lamplight barely reached, a man sat quietly at a small table with his hat tipped low over his brow. He hadn't spoken a word since he'd walked in that morning, content to sip the last of his black coffee and let the chatter of the store wash over him. To most, he was invisible, another weather-worn cowboy passing through. But his silence was the kind that carried weight, the kind people noticed without saying so aloud. His name wasn't one the townsfolk knew well. He'd come to the frontier years ago, worked cattle on a spread farther west, then drifted here when the herd was sold off. Some called him solitary, others said he'd seen too much war to stomach the company of men anymore. But whatever his past, he was known for two things. He spoke little, and he carried himself like a man no one dared cross. From beneath the shadow of his hat, his eyes tracked the scene at the counter. He'd seen the woman enter, weary but proud, the little girl clinging to her skirts like a shadow. He'd watched the mother set her coins down, heard the tremor in her voice as she asked for bread and milk. And he had listened, stone-faced, as the storekeeper refused her, his words dripping with disdain. He had seen cruelty before, on the trail, in the war, in saloons where men's tempers ran hotter than their whiskey. But something about this cruelty, aimed not at a man who could fight back, but at a hungry child, stirred something deep inside him. When the storekeeper shoved the coins back across the counter, the cowboy's fingers tightened slightly around his coffee cup. His jaw worked, the muscle twitching once, though his face remained unreadable to the rest of the room. He stayed seated, waiting, watching. The little girl's tears broke whatever thin thread of patience he had been holding. Her soft sob carried across the store like a bell tolling in his ears. It wasn't just hunger he heard in it. It was fear, shame, the sound of innocence learning too early how harsh the world could be. And that sound more than the storekeeper's cruelty or the townsfolk's silence. Cut straight through the armor he had built around his heart. He thought, for a brief moment, of another child's cry from years long past. A memory he rarely allowed himself to dwell on. A family he had lost, a grave that had never been properly marked. His chest tightened and he forced the memory back into the shadows. Still, the echo of it remained, entwining itself with the sight of the girl clutching her mother's dress in the doorway. The cowboy rose slowly, his boots heavy against the wooden floor. No one noticed at first, not until his chair scraped back with a sharp sound that cut across the murmurs. The storekeeper glanced up, frowning, but the cowboy gave no sign of acknowledgement. He placed his hat firmly on his head, stepped toward the door, and paused only briefly to cast the storekeeper a look. Steady, cold enough to still the man's muttering. Outside, the sun struck him full in the face, but his eyes were not on the light. They were on the figures just a few paces ahead. The woman crouched in the dust, whispering comfort into her daughter's hair, the child's tears leaving streaks across her cheeks. He stood there for a long moment, silent, his shadow falling across the street. Around him, life in town carried on. Wagons rolled, men laughed outside the saloon, a dog barked down the lane. But for him, the world had narrowed to that one fragile pair. Something settled inside him then, not born of pity, but of resolve. The mother might think herself invisible, the child too small to matter to anyone else. But to him, they had become the only thing in that town worth noticing. And though he hadn't yet spoken a word to them, he knew before the sun dipped low that he would. For some burdens were too heavy to let others carry alone, and he was a man who, despite his silence, knew how to bear way. The street outside the general store buzzed with its usual life. Wagons creaked past, horses pawed the ground, and townsfolk went about their business. But for the mother kneeling in the dust with her crying child, the world had shrunk into a circle of despair. She smoothed her daughter's hair with trembling hands, whispering promises she wasn't sure she could keep. Each word was meant to soothe, but inside she felt herself unraveling. From the edge of the boardwalk, the cowboy watched. He didn't rush, didn't speak right away. He understood something about broken souls. Approach too fast, and they'd scatter like spooked cattle. So he took a slow step forward, the thud of his boot deliberate, steady, the kind of sound that drew attention without demanding it. The mother glanced up, startled, her tear-streaked face meeting his eyes. For a heartbeat she froze, uncertain. He was a stranger, tall, broad-shouldered, his hat shadowing features weathered by sun and time. The revolver on his hip and the dust on his duster marked him as a man who lived on the edges. Not one she could afford to trust easily, but his eyes, gray, steady, carrying a quiet weight, were not the eyes of a man seeking to harm. He stopped just short of her, tilting his hat back enough to meet her gaze fully. Then, with a voice low and rough from years of disuse, he spoke. "Ma'am," he began, his tone careful, almost hesitant. "No child should cry for bread." The mother blinked, her lips parting as if to reply, but no words came. The girl clung tighter to her, peeking at the cowboy with wide, fearful eyes. The man knelt then, lowering himself so he wasn't towering over them, his movements unhurried, almost gentle. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper meant only for the mother's ears. "Come with me," he said, each word deliberate, carrying the weight of a promise. "I'll provide." The words hung in the air between them, simple yet powerful. They weren't wrapped in flowery speeches or empty assurances. They were plain, spoken with the kind of certainty that made them feel more like an oath than an offer. The mother's breath caught. She wanted to believe him, but years of hardship and betrayal had taught her caution. She searched his face, looking for a hint of mockery or deceit, but found none. His expression was steady, solemn, as though he had already made up his mind long before speaking. Still, doubt gnawed at her. "Why?" she whispered back, her voice raw. "You don't know us. You don't owe us anything." The cowboy's eyes softened, though his voice remained steady. "Maybe not. But I've seen too much hunger go unanswered. Can't turn my back on it again." There was something in his tone, an old sorrow, a story untold that made her believe he spoke from more than pity. The little girl tugged at her mother's sleeve, her tears slowing. She looked at the cowboy with curiosity now, sensing something in him her young heart trusted. Children often saw truth more clearly than grown folk. The mother hesitated, torn between fear of the unknown and the desperate need pressing down on her. Her pride whispered that accepting help was weakness, but her daughter's hollow cheeks, her trembling body, shouted louder. At last she gave a small nod, her voice nearly breaking as she answered, "If you mean it." The cowboy inclined his head, standing slowly. "I do." His tone carried no room for doubt. He extended his hand, not demanding, but offering. For a moment, the mother stared at it, her heart pounding. Then she took it, rising to her feet with her daughter still clinging to her side. The cowboy's grip was firm, steady, grounding her as though he were anchoring her against the storm that had tossed her for so long. Behind them, through the dusty window of the general store, the storekeeper sneered, muttering under his breath. A few townsfolk exchanged whispers, some disapproving, others quietly admiring the cowboy's boldness. But none of that mattered. For the first time in a long while, the mother felt something unfamiliar stirring in her chest. Hope. And it had come not from charity, but from a promise whispered in the dust by a stranger who meant every word. The mother's hand still rested in the cowboy's as he helped her to her feet. The little girl clung to her skirts, her wide eyes darting between the stranger and the store behind them. The whispered promise hung in the dry air, fragile yet powerful, as though the town itself paused to weigh its meaning. But inside the general store, the weight of silence quickly fractured. The storekeeper, who had been watching from behind the counter, scowled as his lips curled into a sneer. He shoved a ledger aside and leaned forward, his voice sharp enough to cut through the open doorway. "You think you're some kind of hero, cowboy?" he barked, his words dripping with contempt. "Taking in strays, making promises you can't keep? Mark me, ain't no good comes from dragging trouble home." The cowboy didn't turn. He stood tall on the boardwalk, his hat tipped low, his posture steady. The mother stiffened, her pride pricked raw once more, but the cowboy's hand at her elbow anchored her. His silence said more than any argument could. He had heard the insult, but he wasn't going to let it stick. Behind the counter, the storekeeper wasn't done. He slammed a sack of flour down for emphasis, the puff of dust rising like smoke. "You think you'll feed 'em? Shelter 'em? You'll ruin yourself quicker than they'll thank you. Folks like her don't bring nothing but ruin." His voice carried beyond the store, reaching the ears of those milling about on the street. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Townsfolk shifted uneasily, torn between the sting of the storekeeper's cruelty and the weight of the cowboy's silent defiance. An older man spat into the dirt, muttering, "Ain't right," the way he talked to her. But his words were hushed, not meant to travel far. A woman with a basket shook her head, whispering to her companion, "He's asking for trouble. That cowboy don't know what he's getting into." Others simply watched, curiosity tightening their lips, their eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. The mother felt the sting of every word. She wanted to shrink into herself, to take her daughter and flee the sharp edge of the storekeeper's tongue. But when she looked up at the cowboy, she saw no flicker of doubt in his face. His jaw was set, his stance unyielding, and in that moment, she realized he wasn't ashamed of her or of the child pressed against her side. His silence was not weakness, it was strength. Finally, he turned his head just slightly toward the doorway, his voice quiet but steady, each word carrying like a gunshot. "Best mind your own business," the storekeeper faltered, his bluster wavering for a heartbeat. No one in town was foolish enough to push a man like this cowboy too far. The revolver at his side was not decoration, and his reputation for silence carried more weight than loud threats ever could. Still, the storekeeper spat into a bucket and grumbled, "Mark my words, you'll regret it." He turned away, pretending to busy himself with the ledger once more. Though the tension in his shoulders betrayed him, the cowboy shifted his attention back to the mother and child. He didn't waste words on the gossips or the cowardly silence of the others. Instead, he gave the woman a slight nod, as though to say, "Ignore them. They don't matter." She drew in a shaky breath, her daughter clutching her tighter, and for the first time since she had entered the store, she felt no shame. If this man, a stranger, was willing to stand beside her, perhaps she wasn't as invisible as she had thought. The crowd began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others glancing back with quiet admiration. The tension lingered in the air like smoke after a gunfight, but the moment had shifted. The storekeeper's cruelty had been met not with more cruelty, but with something stronger. Resolve. The cowboy adjusted his hat, his voice low as he finally addressed the woman again. "Let's get you and the girl some real food." And just like that, the standoff ended. The townsfolk returned to their errands, the storekeeper muttered under his breath. But the course of 3 lives had already changed. The cowboy led them away from the main street, his stride steady, each step purposeful. The mother walked beside him. Her daughter nestled close at her side, small hand clasping tightly to her mother's skirt. Behind them, the town seemed to exhale, its murmurs fading into the background. Dust swirled around their boots as they left the noise of commerce and gossip behind. The path bent toward the outskirts, where the noise of wagons dulled and the air grew quieter. A few scattered cabins dotted the land, their chimneys releasing thin curls of smoke into the sky. The cowboy's home stood a little apart, a modest wooden cabin built with sturdy hands, its roof patched neatly, its porch swept clean despite the dust. It was not large, nor fancy, but it bore the mark of a man who took care of what was his. The mother hesitated at the edge of the porch, the weight of her pride heavy in her chest. To step across that threshold meant admitting she needed help, something she had always resisted. But her daughter tugged gently at her hand, her wide eyes fixed on the door, her hunger stronger than any doubt. The cowboy noticed her hesitation but said nothing. He simply pushed open the door and stood aside, his silence as steady as his presence. Inside, the cabin was simple but warm. A wood stove stood in the corner, its iron belly already radiating faint heat. Shelves lined with jars of beans, flour, and dried herbs spoke of a man who prepared for long winters. A table with 2 chairs occupied the center, and against one wall rested a narrow but well-kept bed, neatly made with a woolen blanket. Everything was orderly, practical, but not cold. The cowboy moved with quiet efficiency. He set down his hat, rolled up his sleeves, and fetched a loaf of bread from the shelf. From a small crate, he drew out a tin of beans and a jar of fresh milk. The mother's breath caught at the sight. To her, these simple things looked like a feast. Her daughter's eyes followed every movement, her little stomach rumbling audibly. The cowboy placed the bread on the table and cut thick slices, laying them gently before the child. He poured milk into a cup, sliding it toward her with a nod. The girl hesitated only a heartbeat before snatching it up, biting into the bread with wide, grateful eyes. Crumbs scattered across the table as she chewed hungrily, washing it down with gulps of milk that left a white mustache on her lip. The mother stood frozen, her throat tight, watching her daughter eat as though she were witnessing a miracle. Her eyes filled with tears, she tried to blink away. When the cowboy gestured toward the chair, she sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She wanted to thank him, but the words tangled in her chest, too heavy, too fragile to release. The cowboy didn't press her. He ladled beans into a pan, set them over the stove, and soon the room filled with the rich, earthy aroma. He moved with the ease of habit, not boasting, not looking for praise. When he set a plate of beans before her, she finally whispered, "Thank you." He gave only a small nod, as though it needed no reply. The little girl, her hunger eased, looked up at the cowboy with a shy smile. For the first time all day, her face was free of tears. She whispered, "Thank you, mister," before returning to her bread. The mother's heart clenched at that small smile. For days, her daughter's laughter had been swallowed by hunger and fear. Here, in this simple cabin with bread and milk and beans, the sound of life was returning to her child. The cowboy finally sat across from them, silent as ever, his presence steady as the walls around them. He didn't need to say it aloud. They were safe here, at least for tonight. And as the mother watched her daughter eat, she felt, for the first time in too long, that maybe tomorrow would not be as bleak as yesterday. The days that followed unfolded gently, like the slow thaw after a long winter. At first, the mother treated each moment in the cowboy's cabin with careful restraint, as though the warmth and shelter might vanish if she leaned on them too heavily. She rose early, sweeping the floor before he woke, trying to prove her worth. When he returned from tending the horses or chopping wood, he often found the little girl humming quietly, seated by the stove, her small hands busy with scraps of fabric the mother had stitched into a makeshift doll. The cowboy said little, but his silence never felt cold. He showed his care in quiet actions, placing extra wood by the stove without comment, leaving an extra blanket folded neatly at the foot of the bed, or setting aside the last slice of bread for the child. Each gesture spoke more clearly than words, a steady rhythm of provision that gave the mother space to breathe for the first time in months. At first, she resisted. Pride had long been her armor, and she struggled to accept kindness without repayment. She offered to scrub his floors, to cook his meals, to fetch water from the well. He let her help but never treated her labor as owed. When she overdid herself, he would simply murmur, "Rest, you've done enough," before taking the bucket from her hands. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, the three of them shared supper by lamplight. The girl, her hunger now eased, had begun to chatter again, her voice bright and eager. She told the cowboy about her doll, about the birds she'd seen that day, about how she wanted to ride a horse one day if Mama allowed it. The cowboy listened with quiet patience, nodding at the right times, even letting a faint smile tug at the corner of his mouth. The mother watched him closely, noticing the way his eyes softened when the child spoke, the way he leaned slightly forward, as though her words mattered. It stirred something in her, a recognition that he wasn't merely tolerating their presence. He was welcoming it. Later that night, after the girl had fallen asleep on the cot he had built from spare boards, the mother sat by the stove, sewing by the faint glow of the lamp. The cowboy sharpened his knife at the table, the rasp of steel against stone filling the quiet. After a long silence, she spoke. "You didn't have to do this," she said softly, not looking up from her stitching. "You didn't have to take us in." The rasping stopped. He set the knife down slowly, his gaze steady on her. "Didn't have to," he agreed. "But needed to." She finally met his eyes, puzzled. "Why?" His jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, in that same low, gravelly voice, he said, "Because I know what it's like to lose everything, and I know what it costs to keep going anyway." There was no pity in his tone, only truth. She saw in his eyes the shadows of a past he didn't share, the weight of grief carried too long. And though he didn't speak of it again, the understanding lingered between them like an unspoken pact. Both had known loss, but neither had given up. In the days that followed, trust began to take root. The girl's laughter grew more frequent, a sound that softened the cabin's silence. The mother's shoulders, once perpetually hunched under invisible burdens, began to ease. She found herself watching the cowboy when he worked outside, noticing the steadiness in his movements, the quiet dignity of a man who did not boast, did not demand, but simply gave. It was not love, not yet. But it was the fragile beginning of belonging, forged in bread shared at the table, in the small kindnesses of daily life, in the steady presence of a man who had whispered, "I'll provide," and proved it day after day. The cabin had become more than just a shelter. It was beginning to feel like a haven. Yet, as the days passed, the quiet peace seemed fragile, like a flame that could be snuffed out by the faintest wind. The mother felt it most at night, when the little girls slept soundly and the hush of the prairie pressed against the walls. That was when memories returned, the sound of her husband's angry words, the shame of being turned away at the store, the endless ache of wondering how she would feed her child. Safety was new, and with safety came the unsettling freedom to remember. One evening, when the wind howled low against the eaves, She sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a tin cup of tea the cowboy had brewed. He sat opposite her, whittling a piece of wood with practiced precision. The steady scrape of his knife against the grain filled the silence, a rhythm as reliable as his presence. She watched him for a long while before speaking, her voice barely more than a whisper. "Do you ever wonder if the past will catch up with you?" The knife paused mid-scrape. His eyes lifted to hers, unreadable but weighted with understanding. He set the wood and knife aside, leaning back in his chair. "Past doesn't need to catch up," he said quietly. "It walks beside us. Every step." The words struck her deep. She looked down at her hands, fingers trembling slightly. Mine feels heavier every day. I married a man who wanted a son, and when I gave him a daughter, he left us. Said we were no use to him. Since then, every door I've knocked on feels the same. Closed." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words out. "I tried to be strong for her, but some days, I wasn't sure I could go on." The admission cost her more than she expected. Shame rose hot in her chest, and she could not bring herself to meet his eyes. The cowboy didn't speak right away. Instead, he stood, crossed to the stove, and tossed another log into the fire. The flames flared, casting long shadows across the cabin. Finally, he said, "A man who walks away from his family, he's the one with no use." "Not you." She looked up, startled, and for the first time saw something raw flicker across his face. "My wife," he said slowly, voice rough with memory, "was taken by fever. Our boy, too. I buried them with my own hands. After that, I stopped talking much. Folks said I was cold. Truth is, I just didn't have anything left to say." The silence that followed was heavy, but not uncomfortable. It was the silence of shared pain, recognized and honored. Her eyes softened, tears welling despite her effort to hold them back. "I'm sorry," she whispered. He shook his head, gaze steady on the fire. "Don't be. Grief shapes us, but it doesn't own us. We keep moving. That's all we can do." The little girl stirred in her sleep then, murmuring softly. Both adults glanced toward her, the mother with instinctive concern, the cowboy with quiet protectiveness. In that moment, something passed between them, an understanding that though their pasts were different, their scars were kin. From then on, their conversations deepened. Not every night, not every day, but in bits and pieces. He told her about the seasons he'd spent alone on the ranch, how silence had become his only companion. She told him about her struggles to keep her daughter fed, about the fear that had hollowed her out. These weren't grand confessions, but steady unveilings, like peeling back the bark of an old tree to reveal the rings within. And slowly, as shadows of the past were laid bare, the present grew lighter. The cabin no longer felt haunted by what they had lost, but brightened by what might still be built. Dawn broke soft and golden, spilling over the prairie like a promise. The cabin, once a place of solitude and silence, now stirred with new rhythms, the clatter of a small girl's laughter, the low murmur of a woman humming while she worked, and the steady footsteps of a cowboy who no longer walked alone. Life was not suddenly easy, but it had shifted. What once felt like survival had begun to feel like living. The little girl was the first to rise that morning. She padded barefoot across the floor, her doll tucked beneath her arm, and climbed onto the porch to watch the sun climb higher. The cowboy was already there, leaning against the railing with his hat in hand, gazing across the wide land that stretched endlessly before them. She slipped her small hand into his without a word, and he squeezed it gently. For him, the gesture was simple. For her, it was trust. Inside, the mother prepared breakfast, her movements slower, more relaxed than when she had first arrived. She no longer rushed as if afraid the food would disappear. There was enough now. The cowboy had made sure of it. When she stepped outside to call them in, she paused, taking in the sight. Her daughter leaning against the man who had once been a stranger, now a figure of safety. Her heart swelled with gratitude, and something deeper, something she dared not yet name. Over the meal, they spoke of small things, the weather, the horses, the coming season. But beneath the ordinary words lay an unspoken acknowledgement that their lives were no longer separate paths crossing briefly, but threads weaving together. The mother noticed the way her daughter laughed freely now, her eyes brighter, her cheeks rounder with good food. That, more than anything, convinced her they had found not just kindness here, but a future. Later that day, as the cowboy saddled his horse to ride into town for supplies, the mother hesitated at the doorway. "You don't have to keep doing all this," she said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of unspoken fears. "We don't want to be a burden." He turned, adjusting the reins, his eyes meeting hers with steady conviction. "You're not." She opened her mouth to protest, but he stepped closer, his voice dropping low, the way it had the day they met. "You needed someone to stand beside you. And truth is, I needed it too, alone. It's no way to live." Her breath caught, words failing her. In his gaze, she saw no pity, no obligation, only truth. The same truth that had been there in the store when he whispered, "Come with me, I'll provide." That night, as the three of them sat by the fire, the mother finally allowed herself to relax fully, her head resting lightly against the back of the chair, her daughter curled up beside her. The cowboy sat across from them, whittling quietly, the glow of the fire painting his face in warm light. For the first time, the silence between them wasn't born of grief or caution, it was comfort. In the weeks that followed, their bond grew stronger. The mother began tending a small garden behind the cabin, planting seeds with her daughter's eager help. The cowboy built a fence, mended the barn, and began speaking more. Small stories about the land, advice about horses, and even a rare chuckle at the girls' playful antics. Each day layered new pieces of life upon the old, until the shadows of the past felt less like burdens and more like reminders of how far they had come. It wasn't a grand declaration or a sudden change that marked their new beginning. It was the quiet assurance of belonging, the way the girl reached for the cowboy's hand without hesitation, the way the mother's laughter returned, soft but sure, the way the cowboy no longer avoided the gaze of others when he rode into town. The future stretched wide before them, uncertain but filled with possibility. And as the prairie wind whispered through the grass, carrying the scent of earth and promise, the three of them sat together beneath the fading light, no longer strangers, no longer lost. They had found one another, and that was enough.